Shikara Shikara Smira Samili Manohara Varikarasika Mama Pipanidi Supriya Charana Kinkaring Guru Tavai Vasmi Na Jivami Tayavina Iti Vigyaruta Namam Charanantikam Yatkin Kreshu Vausa Kaluka Kavani Nitapala Shapurusha Shakandamuli Tashikadara Sanideva Sabanu Jayas Tatkeli Kunjabavananganama Janishama Bhajami Radha Radavinda Nitram Smarami Radha Madhura Smitasham Vadami Radha Karuna Bharajam Tato Monastigati Nakapi Pakita Vahina Yaparada Lakshay Chipta Shita Marita Rangamaji Kripamai Twang Sharanang Prapana Vrinde Namaste Charanara Vindam Kanaka Jalada Gatro Nila Sobhagya Netro Viriguvara Varavalo Malati Kundamalo Targana Taruna Vesho Nilapitambaresho Smaranini Brittani Kunje Radhika Krishna Chandro Vancha Kalpaturubhischa Vipa Sindhu Vayevacha Patitana Bhavanevyo Vaishnavevyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaur Bhaktivedanta Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Dandavad Pranam devotees. So today's class is a little bit different. The class is really something that I've dealt with over the course of years for some time. And I thought it was always very important subject matter because our Srila Prabhupada thought it to be very important. Srila Prabhupada, when he started the movement, not too long after that, he started what was called the BI of the Bhaktivedanta Institute, which was a collection of, scientists and other persons in our movement who were part of the academic community. And he wanted them to be able to present the theistic concepts regarding science and obviously to defeat any atheistic ideas about science, because he felt that atheism was the root of, the essential mood of Devoniac culture is when it is based in atheism. Actually, even in Srila Prabhupada's pranam mantra, Nirvasesha Sunyavari Paschatchadesha Tarine. So when I first heard the pranam mantra and studied it a little bit closely, I was thinking, who in Paschatchadesh means the Western world, pretty much America and so forth and so on, who is it here that is really steeped or schooled in the Shariraka Bhashya of Shankaracharya? So who knew these things? So why would that become an emphasis? Nirvishe Sunyavari Paschatchadesh Tarine. So, but then some years later, on a more deep scrutiny of what that meant, it didn't necessarily mean that people were learned Vedantists, impersonalists. It simply meant that most people, either their central conception about life was voidist or impersonal. That was inclusive of the idea that there's nothing, this life is the all in all. It didn't rise also just to the level of the Buddhist concept of nirvana voidism, but it meant everything that went down from there to the sort of idea just eat, joy, and what is it? Eat, drink, and be merry life, because there's nothing after this, so everything is void. Or every variation of the concepts of impersonalism, from actually their God is just one great energy, which is impersonal. Even that's somewhat okay, right? It's not our theology, but it's somewhat okay. But down to the idea where even without any kind of philosophical backing or so forth, people had the idea, I am God. Right? Because anytime a person thinks two things predominantly, which is I am the karta and the karana, it automatically produces the tendency to bhokta means I'm the enjoyer. If I'm the karta, the doer, and I'm the karana, the cause, then I'm naturally the bhokta. I'm the enjoyer. So that was everywhere when Srila Prabhupada came, because everybody thought like that. I'm the cause of everything in my existence. I'm the doer of everything in my existence. And therefore, I'm the entitled enjoyer. So the Nirvase Sunyavadi dealt with all of these kind of things. So also, predominantly the sort of mainstay of these ideas pretty much were based in the sort of worldview that people held in life. And a great deal of what your worldview is has to do with what your educational experience is, because we all had to go to school for some reason or another, right? So when you went to school, whatever was taught in the school, that had a conscious impact on your worldview. Now, people may have rejected it as they got into different, iterations of their life. They may have rejected some things they learned in school, but a lot of those foundational elements were there. Now, everybody here is of different ages. I'm in my 70s. I don't even remember if I learned Darwinism. I don't even remember. How many people did consciously remember learning it in school, either in college or any other period? So you don't remember either? I don't really remember. Now, I'm pretty sure it was, because it's something that was established in academia for many, many years. So I had spoken on this once before in a different forum, but it was on what is divine science and what is pseudoscience. And sometimes when the word pseudoscience comes up, it's immediately applied to the very things we're doing now, which is worshiping God, having a theology, having certain set of rituals, which they call dogma, and anything else that doesn't fit within a very narrow box, which has been developed and codified in very recent times. It's not even a idea of antiquity at all. It's very recent. We're going back to the late 16th century, early 17th century when we start to get these things. So I want to go over some things, and obviously I need some notes. I am not a scientist, so I do need some notes to deal with this. So the first thing is to declare, well, what is science? And I'm not even sure when this definition came into the lexicon at all, but this is a definition that's there in the dictionary. Science is a systematic, evidence-based approach to understanding the universe. And it relies on, then it gives the following. It involves making an observation, formulating testable hypotheses, conducting experiments, and building predictive models to explain natural and social phenomena. Now, that's a more broad. I've seen it where it's just narrowed down to a study of the natural world. So whatever studied is strictly based on empiricism, and there is no idea of a social phenomenon beyond that, right? Now the definition is starting to include that, because obviously you have to accommodate the sciences like psychology and all of these things. So now you have to include that in a definition of study, even though we're going to point out how many of those studies also lack so many variables. So that's the definition. So some of the ideas about science is that it became strictly empirically based. So empirical means just what I can perceive by my senses, what I can see, what, not even what I can hear so much, but especially what I could see, what I can function with my five senses. That became the basis of science. So the question would be, when and how did that happen? So as I was mentioning, in the late 16th century, early 17th century, the Catholic Church in Europe was very much the sort of patron facility of all philosophy, theology, and science. So at that time, those three things were still synthesized. And I'm going to get to it later, but if you go back in all kinds of cultures of antiquity, that's always been the case. So what happens in the 16th, late 16th, early 17th, and then going forward in Europe? The church has a situation in which you have people now investigating all kinds of phenomena. They are all religious people. They're all religious people. Almost every single theory that you got at that time came from somebody who was related to the church. Who knows where the Big Bang Theory came from? George Lemaitre. George Lemaitre was a French priest. He came up with the idea of the Big Bang Theory. So almost every single person was either in the clergy itself or was closely affiliated with the church. So then when you go back a little further than that, you start to get into people like, obviously, Copernicus, Galileo, and other people who are also scientists. But at that time, science was, this is the creation of God. We're exploring how the creation of God works. Now what happens is two things which are pretty, and I'm kind of summarizing some of the stuff because we started a little late, but what happens is two things which are pretty key. One is that as they get more developed in what they can observe the natural world, they don't always find a direct alignment with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Then God created Adam and Eve. And so Christian theology at that time was taken literally. Nobody did question it because it would become heresy. So you didn't question it at all. But now they're making observations and they're saying, well, wait a minute. First of all, maybe it's a heliocentric universe, which means things revolve around the sun, not the other way around, and so forth and so on. So all of these things now bring up a situation within the Christian clergy. How do we deal with this? So the church, based on its power, decided we'll just shut it down. Anybody who says anything that doesn't align directly with the literal interpretations of the Bible, we'll just shut it down as heresy. We won't even bother to deal with the arguments involved in it. So that's where you get the Inquisition, you get all these kind of things, which was literally when the church could order somebody to be killed over such things as blasphemy, heresy, and so forth. So obviously that then begins a kind of departure, in a slight way at first, of those who were scientists mostly, not so much philosophers, but scientists from the church, because everybody had a fear that if somehow or another I make a discovery that doesn't align with the theology, what could my fate be? I have a dedicated desire to follow up on these things that I'm experiencing, learning, and so forth. I believe they're part of God's creation, but the church has to, or wants it to be, literally aligned with what they're saying. And where it doesn't align with that, I could be accused of heresy. That could lead to death. So it wasn't like now you get into a philosophical argument and say, well, we agree to disagree. No, we agree to kill you if you don't agree. That became the idea. So as things went along, there began to be a gradual shift away from the auspices of the church, or being sheltered by the church, and some scientists beginning to say, well, listen, we just can't find any reconciliation between our pursuits in natural science and what's going on with the church. So those who could no longer find any kind of patronage by the church were welcomed by the aristocracy. The aristocracy meant those who were wealthy and so forth, because they thought from the knowledge that's being gleaned, so many inventions will come. So both from a monetary point of view, as far as business is concerned, from an enjoyment point of view, as far as what's created, like even up to this day, the cell phone, the microwave, whatever it might be, will enjoy those facilities. So the aristocracy welcomed them. Okay, come on up, we'll take care of you, we'll provide for you. In fact, they started to develop the whole idea of universities and so forth. This isn't the genesis of universities, but they built schools for them, places for them, et cetera, so that they could carry on their work and they would reap the results of whatever was discovered. Like even now to this day in modern society, whatever's done in science ends up in R&D departments of some company. You understand? So that's the base model for this even back then. So now that this begins to take place, then even those who were very religious, and this includes the person who founded the scientific method, Francis Bacon, he was not, which I always thought previously, that he founded the scientific method to sort of create the genesis of atheism. He didn't. What he did do was say, listen, we recognize that there's a metaphysical world and a physical world. We can only deal with what's in our purview. In other words, what I can physically deal with empirically, that becomes the most easy thing for me to understand as far as God's creation is concerned. What's metaphysical, I can't, it wasn't like he was practicing bhakti or something, right? I can't necessarily access, but I can access this. It wasn't that he didn't believe there was a metaphysical aspect. He simply said, let's concentrate on what we can experience here. So then he set up these rules that I read earlier around what is the scientific method. Later on, with that departure from the shelter of the church and coming under the shelter of the materialists, basically they said, well, we no longer have any need, since we're not provided for, sheltered by the church. We no longer need for their patronage as far as finances and support. We have no more need for their theology. You understand? So now we will go ahead and move completely into a materialistic idea. This is not the genesis of atheism, but it becomes a strong motivation for atheism to become a process which now becomes academic, which becomes pushed as the standard. You understand? So I'm skipping ahead of a lot of things. So this is all called the scientific revolution. Again, it's end of 16th century into the 17th century, late 16th century into the 17th century. Now, of course, this starts to grow and grow and grow. This sort of divide between theism and atheist views and science. So that synthesis now is not broken. Who went under the patronage of the sort of aristocracy and so forth, they themselves have now broken off and created sort of an atheistic model of science. This was not the original plan of even the person who set up the scientific method. All these people were still very religious people. Understand? Now, a key turning point will come, and I'm skipping way ahead. A key turning point will come with Darwin. That's why he's the focus of so much attention. I think it's in 1859, he's going to write that book on the origin of species. And when he writes this book on the origin of species, if you look at it closely and even look at letters he wrote around the book and everything else, he simply had an idea, he had some observations, and he said, well, let me go ahead and map out an idea because everybody wants to know what's the origin of life, where did everything come from? So let me go ahead and map out what I've understood thus far. So that's essentially what the origin of species was. It wasn't a declaration of absolute truth. It was what he understood at the time, what facilities he had at the time. And he, in his earlier life, though being religious, by the time he's writing on the origin of species, he's become agnostic, actually. And he actually mentions in his own letters in history, he went through a whole period of actual atheism, right? So now he's writing this with that basis, that actually everything doesn't necessarily have to have some kind of metaphysical origin, et cetera, et cetera. He comes up with two ideas. You might know what the two ideas are? Yeah, not so much that the is the basis of it. But he comes up with natural selection and random mutation, essentially. He comes up with the idea almost like natural selection is almost like a survival of the fittest model. And random mutation means that everything that we see, all the different species we see, everything else, simply happen by their adaptation to their environments, their need to survive. There'll be random mutation where some animals, even some whole classes of human beings would go on. This is before we even get to the basis of how he's basing it, right? They would go on simply on the basis of the ability to survive. This was natural selection, and the mutations were random. So let's say that, even though you don't find it in the experiments, he couldn't prove it, right? But the idea was that, let's say a giraffe, I'm giving an example. He eats vegetation from a tree, he can't reach the tree. So over the course of time, and he says many, many years, then the neck would grow and grow and grow till it could be seen. So this was called random mutation. Now, many of these things they can't really find evidence for, but at the time it became gospel for two reasons. One is the support of the materialist saying, okay, we got an idea of the origin. We don't need a theological explanation for where everything came from. So the idea is then back to what you were talking about. Part of what he proposed was that actually there was some idea of like everything generating from like a one-celled entity, right? And gradually grew over the course of time, millions and millions of years. And it became so developed and so complex that it's now Mukunda speaking at the temple on Sunday. So this was, I'm giving a nutshell of what he was proposing. You understand? Then with the Big Bang theory of Lemaitre, he proposes that actually, that in the beginning, because by now there's some development of their ability to look back into the universe through telescopes, because now telescopes have become more developed and so forth. And they look back and they see that the universe appears to be expanding. And because the universe appears to be expanding, it indicates something must have happened that caused the universe to expand out. And especially as you look through a telescope and you go back, as you get further and further back through the telescope, you notice that the color starts to shift towards the red spectrum. So this is called redshifting. And the idea is that when you look back, it's indicating something must have happened, some kind of explosion or something else that caused the universe to blow out and start expanding like this. So I was talking to my wife the other day, even in our theology, would not a breath of Mahavishnu give that same appearance? You understand? The universe is expanding out. And also the power, what if he's thinking about a Big Bang, what is the power of the breath of Mahavishnu? You understand? But we want to stay away from the theological part right now. But so based on that, he came up with the idea there was a Big Bang. As the earth cooled, right? As it got further and further away from that initial explosion, it cooled. It set itself up where it got crusted and everything else. I'm paraphrasing all the stuff. And then, as Prabhu said, there was a kind of big muddy pool. And in that, there somehow or another, right? So our biogenesis, somehow or another, some things just were struck by lightning or whatever else happened. They combined together, huh? Magic. It's some lightning struck it or something. It started to create a one cell thing. And then I spoke from there, how it developed. So now this theory, you have to think back at the time, somebody had a theory. And for the materialist, it was a theory that could hold water because it was being accepted by the atheistic science. And they could use this as a model. Not only atheistic science, even others were exploring it. Yeah, it could seem to make sense because there was no challenging elements to it yet. So now this becomes not only part of the scientific community as the explanation of, here's where they're careful now, because now there's something called Neo-Darwinism, where they don't claim it's describing the origin of life, right? They're just describing how things evolved from whatever happened. They had to get away from the idea it's the origin of life because they could not prove that, right? So this is how things happen after whatever went on in the beginning. This is how it evolved, right? So now Neo-Darwinism focuses on evolution more than origin of life understanding. So now the material scientists grab and say, we have an explanation. We really don't need to deal with theological explanations, whether it be Christianity or whatever. Another issue that comes up here was, what was the only theological framework they had to challenge? Christianity. They didn't have to challenge, and all the other Abrahamic religions like Islam come from Christianity. So if you could defeat the Christian theology on that basis, you were good to go with everything that came as a precedent to it, right? It means Judaism or what came after it, form of Islam, right? But they never challenged any other theological concept anywhere else in the world. Did everybody else not have a theology? Of course, in India or in Bharat, there was a very developed theology, which gave explanation to many of these things. Atomic theory was there. The whole idea of cosmology was there. Ayurveda was there. There were so many things, but they just stayed away from that. You understand? So challenging Christian theology, it was more easy to defeat an idea that God created the world in 7 days, beginning with Adam and Eve and so forth and so on. Now, also, as I mentioned earlier, the lack of the clergy to be able to give, is this on actual history, right? So just for our sake alone, biblically speaking, the Word was with God. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. Is that an ontologically true statement? That's actually Advaya Gyan Paratattva. That's actually what that is. It's Advaya Gyan Paratattva. So God, because even in our theology, we consider that the world comes into being. Omkar, right? That's the primordial sound. And that Omkar is directly Krishna himself. In Chaitanya Charitamrita is written, Akara Krishna, Ukara Radha, Makara Jiva. And Chandrabindi means praying. You understand? So it's not off base, but if you can't explain that, and you're saying in the beginning was a word, right? And their understanding of a word is the same thing I'm speaking to you, right? And that was with God, and then it was God. And you understand? If you don't have the ability to theologically back that up, then they got you. And that's what began to happen. So the combination of the church's influence by force, inability to explain the ontology biblically, and the now explanations of people like Darwin, and the patronage of materialism developed a pseudoscience. I'm saying it's pseudoscience because unless and until you have all the variables, how can something be called science if the basis of science is that you have to do a hypothesis, experimentation, observation? If you don't have all the variables, how can your conclusion be called science? And if the variables don't include the metaphysical aspect, right? Because even they acknowledge there must be something, right? We don't know what it is. So what's an atheist answer to the idea we don't know what happened at the beginning?
We'll find out in the future.
We'll find out in the future.
We just don't know yet.
We just don't know yet, right? But we'll find out in the future. A post-dated check, Srila Prabhupada used to say. But not only that, the difficulty becomes when you then try to establish which is happening now, by the way. There's a big movement in the scientific community called intelligent design. Has anybody ever heard of that? So intelligent design are scientists who have, realized, and this is not recent, this has been going on for years, but they have traced the science back. 1953, there's more understanding about the nature of cellular structure and DNA and all these things. So now looking at the complexity of these things, they're saying, no, it's not possible that this is random. Because doing the math on it to get the exact coding in your DNA exactly right for every person at all times, in all circumstances, that's mathematically impossible. Right? So it's mathematically impossible for it to be random.
Billion bits of information in one piece of DNA.
In one piece of DNA. And the codes are pretty exacting. It's like 4 letters or something, and they have to line up and this and that, and it's reproducible over and over and over and over again. You understand? So, and the way RNA works and so forth and so on. So the problem now becomes, listen, these things are so complex that we can't just align them with randomness. But we've locked in to Darwin, so we can't change, because if we change now, it appears we made a mistake. And in science, you can't go back, especially on your root theory, and say, oh, my bad. You understand? My bad. So now you've got to fight tooth and nail to keep the foundational basis under which you began this whole kind of science. You understand? So they fight tooth and nail, and the result of that is called the science cartel. Right? So the science cartel, really, I put up a little documentary in my post on this, and it's a documentary about how the scientific cartel, and I'm trying to find it here because I don't keep all these things in my mind. I got other things to think about.
Modern day Inquisition.
That's what it's exactly like. That if you don't fit what it is they want, and anybody who works in the field of science, thank God I didn't or don't, right? How you become peer reviewed, how your articles are approved, how you get grants, everything is based on your alignment with that scientific cartel. You understand? They monopolize the industry, so to speak. So those who were initially trying to look at the idea of intelligent design, people lost jobs, they lost careers, tenured professors were certainly not at the schools they were at. So this was literal, like you're saying, a modern day inquisition, where they would fire people, say it's not what you posted or written or said leans towards theology, and therefore it's not acceptable in our academic curriculum or whatever it might be. Even if it was just let's check it out. They just completely shut it down. But younger scientists coming up with more consensus around other scientists looking at it begin to say, no, we're not going to just shut down because the scientific cartel, won't allow us to make it a final statement or a deep statement in the scientific community. So they continue to promote it. And what the intelligent design is essentially saying is, when you look at the complexity of human existence, when you look at the complexity of the cosmos, everything else, it is not possible that there's a random, unguided process that began all of this and that maintains it. So this is what intelligent design is. So they're continuing to push people like Stephen Myers and others and so forth and so on. But then you've got others who are the poster children of the opposition, which are people like Richard Dawkins and so forth. Even Stephen Hawkins, unfortunately, his situation was like that, who pushed the continuum being completely void of any theistic connection. You understand? So now as we come into more modern times, that is firmly established in academia. So now when you go to school, like we said, some people remember that you had to learn Darwin in school. And if you put on there anything else, like, well, no, God created the world or something, you're not passing that test. So even though it seems minor, especially all of us who are adults now and past that phase, for people coming up, that's deep. Suppose it's one of our devotee children, they go to a school, they would have to write down in agreement with that idea if it's on a test. So now,
At least when we were in school, it was still presented as a theory.
Yeah, but now it's law. Now it's law, and there are actually court cases. Huh?
Yeah. The scientific theory means something that's been proven.
No.
No, no.
Theory means that it might be true.
It might be true, but their whole thing is relative.
Theories might be true.
A law is true. A law is true. Theory can be disproved.
A theory can be, but this is the process. This is the problem with the scientific theory. One process in the scientific method is that it has to be falsifiable, which means if a new theory is presented. But here's the problem, is that when they do present a theory, until it's disproven, they consider it law. That's the problem. They consider this as gospel.
It has to be empirical, so they have to be measurable.
Right.
Not necessarily by our senses,
Right.
but by the devices.
Experiments, telescopes,
So what we have to
microscopes.
do is provide a way to empirically prove that our philosophy is correct.
That can be done. And here's the problem in the debates that people have with atheists, is that we immediately revert to the subjective transcendent experience as proving God. You understand? And their argument would be, which I was going to go to at the end, but I'll bring up a little bit now, is that why should I have to go through a subjective experience like you had in order to see it? It should be empirical. Everybody should be able to see it. But actually, God is empirically available. So intelligent design is saying, how would you explain by observation, continued experiment in this world that we can see every single day? Have you ever seen something which has consistent order and design that doesn't have a designer? You understand? That's like a case closed argument, basically. Where have you seen it? You've never seen anything that has order and design. If you look at any painting in this room, question is, who's the artist? If you wanted to get into who built this building, it's going to be who built it. So every single thing we look at in our everyday experience is the experiment. So the hypothesis of intelligent design has not only experimentation in a scientific way, but in a common sense way that everybody can see. That there has to be something which had an intelligence, like you're mentioning about DNA and these things. And these are some of the things that brought this to the forefront. It's not possible mathematically to do these things without some kind of intelligent design. Plus, information, like in a code, that could produce this level of complexity, we don't see it happen randomly. Have you ever gone and bought your computer from Apple and say, wait a minute, we'll just put the things on the table and later on come back, pick up an hour later? We don't. Somebody had to code it. Somebody had to write the code for it and all of that. So we don't see it in practical existence. So why should we accept that it exists as the origin of the most complex things we see in nature? How can we accept that? So this is common sense. This is why, though there's 9-point-something billion people on the planet, the general idea is that 80% have the idea of a superior being. So first of all, this atheistic science and scientists are in an extreme minority, because even the 20% that's left, some will outright say, I don't know. I don't know if there's a God or not, right? Some will say, well, I don't know, but I haven't seen proof of it or something else. Very few so boldly say there is no God. Like persons like Richard Dawkins, who will write something like the God Delusion or something, that everybody who believes in God, basically this came out of some crisis in your life, or it came out of your need to survive, so you put up an imaginary figure to help you cope with life. These are the kind of things they say. You understand? It's crazy.
They do it though. They do it too.
They do it, yeah. It's crazy. I mean, if you hear the arguments, they're so ridiculous. And it's something Gurukul kids in our movement would like to feed. You understand? But it's become part of that scientific cartel that says this is law now. Because the danger is, if there's a theological presentation, then you have to deal with everything that comes as a result of the science that's sinful has now put on a moral measuring ground. You understand? And when you go way back even to the aristocracy who gave shelter to those scientists, part of the reason they did it, because they didn't want to face sinful in our attempt to enjoy, have to now face the scrutiny of the church. So we want to be free from that scrutiny. We want to live without the scrutiny of any higher being. So atheism is more than just I don't believe in God. It's the desire for materialism to exist free from guilt. You understand? Free from guilt materialism. This is why there are even changes in the Bible. They took reincarnation out of the Bible basically during the adaptations of King James Version, because the king wanted to be able to live his life without the idea I'm going to have to pay for this in the future. You understand? So if I'm going to cheat, drink, this, that, I don't have to face the idea I got to. So you can keep God, but I don't want God having to deal with me for what I'm doing here or later on. Mm-hmm. All right, we started late, so I'm going to skip ahead because I'm going to have the chance to have some discussion. So now when you look back, another thing that becomes very outstanding is the fact that this is extremely recent things. So you're talking about less than 500 years ago. What was the idea of science way back into antiquity? So I pulled up so many of the cultures, and these are some places I've actually been. Like I've been to Egypt before and was able to talk to people there about their conceptions regarding religion. We were basically dealing with their spiritual modality or whatever. But there's a principle in ancient Egypt, or Kemet, they sometimes call it, called Ma'at. Ma'at was the idea that theology, philosophy, and science were always one thing, inseparable. Do we have the same conception? Yeah. So this was called Ma'at, the idea that you cannot separate the three things, because that would be saying that God has something that's not related to him. You understand? This becomes, there's something in the creation not related to God. So Ma'at was the principle that everything we see, everything we experience, both on the subjective level and objective level, is related to divinity. And that the realization of yourself and the natural world had to do with relating yourself to divinity. This is the whole process. So this was called Ma'at in ancient Egypt. Ma'at, yeah. Mahat, yeah. Mahat Tattva. So then again in Africa, which I preached in Africa for like 8 years, and they have a concept called Ubuntu. Ubuntu is more in South Africa and so forth, but Ubuntu means exactly the same thing. The unification of your theology, philosophy, and science. It's called Ubuntu. In West Africa, like among the Yoruba people, they have a concept called Ifa. And in Ifa, the idea is that there is a unification or synthesis again between God, who's Olodumare, and everything else in the natural creation. In fact, also one of the features of the practice of Ifa is that they have a system of counseling people called the Table of Ifa. Table of Ifa essentially is like our Jyotis. You understand? The amazing thing about it is that they use a method of either 2 or 1, and the number of possibilities that comes out of that is 256 different Odu, which can lead to infinite things. Where have we heard that before? Is there any computer scientists in the room?
Binary.
Binary, yeah. So this is in ancient times they had this, right? What about in the Far East? Well, even though the Far East has a lot of the influence of Buddhism, the idea of Taoism or Taoism was again a synthesis between the natural world and divinity. They didn't see a separation between those things. That's what's called the Tao or Tao, right? So in every single ancient culture, you found the same thing. There's a whole bunch of them I have listed here, but essentially that's it. Now, certainly in Vedic culture, we have what is called Ved. Where does the word Ved comes from? Knowledge or Gyan or truth or reality. So the Ved was the knowledge of the synthesis between divinity, practice related to divinity, and the creation. Because in the Veda, all of those things are covered. What's not covered in Vedic Sastra? I'm asking. Everything is covered. Now, the one thing that we have that is very helpful for us is the parampara, which is transmitted the knowledge down in succession. So we have that same knowledge today. So what we have in Srimad Bhagavatam in those 12 cantos, because the Bhagavatam is also the embodiment of the Vedas. You understand? What is this verse? Atam Brahma Sutranam Bar Atam Vinir Noya Gayatri Bhasha Ruposo Ved Artha Paribrahmita. That the Srimad Bhagavatam is the conclusion called Vedanta Sutra. Even itihasas like Mahabharata, the conclusions of what they're meant to teach is also in Srimad Bhagavatam. Bhasha Ruposo. Does anybody really know the deep meaning of what this is? Gayatri is the essential mantra of the Vedas, the Brahma Gayatri. You understand? That Brahma Gayatri is the sum and substance of all Ved. With the Bij, what is the beginning Bij of the Brahma Gayatri? Omkar. Omkar is Radha, Krishna, the Jiva, and Prem. You understand? And then the mantra, I can't obviously recite the mantra here, but it plays out as an unfoldment of describing transcendence coming to the perfection, because the idea, I can say some things, Savituhe does not mean the sun god, right? But because if the qualifying word is Savitu Varinyam, Varinyam means a superior category of Surya Narayan, who's the origin of Surya Dev. The superlative category of Narayan is whom? Krishna. Where does Narayan come from? Krishna, right? And then, without going into it too deep, but I have heard Gurudev explain before, what is Bharagol? Is the power of that person who Varinya means Krishna. The power of Krishna is whom? Shrimati Radharani. Devasha means Divyati, means their Leela. The prayer that should unfold in my heart is the basis of Gayatri. So that Gayatri is fully explained in Srimad Bhagavatam. Understand? Sometimes it's also asked, like many times I've been helping some devotees with the mantras, because sometimes, it's difficult if you took the mantras a long time ago and so forth and so on, right? So, and especially for some devotees who never got Siksha of the mantras. So one of the things is that in our Gaudiya line, ladies do not chant Brahma Gayatri. Does anybody know why? Where else does Brahma Gayatri appear in our mantras? In Kam Gayatri. In Padma Puran, it's mentioned that seeing the good fortune of the personified Vedas, then Gayatri Mata prayed, I want that good fortune. I also want to become a Gopi. That Gopi became known as Kam Gopi or Kam Gayatri. Understand? So the Kam Gayatri itself is the mature form of Brahma Gayatri. Understand? So when we have, but it is more direct. In the Madhya Lila of Chaitanya Charitamrita, Madhya Lila chapter 8 is mentioned here. Vrindavane Apakrita Navina Madan, Kam Bij, Kam Gayatri, Yandra Upasan. The meaning of this Bij and the mantra, the Gayatri, is that it is for the worship of Vrindavane Apakrita Navina Madan. Understand? So Vrindavane means Braj. Vrindavane Aprakrit, transcendent. Naveen Madan. What does Naveen Madan mean?
Cupid.
The ever fresh Cupid, who's Krishna. But here's the secret, because at the end of the mantra, this becomes important, right? What is being mentioned here about that ever fresh Cupid? What makes Krishna ever fresh? We're getting off our subject matter here, but
Because he's always seeking a prem.
Anurag. In the crumb of Prem, Anurag literally means that which makes something newer and newer. Saranu Bhuta Kuryam Nava Navaha Priya. In Ujalimani it's written. That thing which makes the lover appear ever and ever new, this is what's called Anurag. You understand? So here it's describing in the Kam Gayatri, that love which is experienced by the gopis in Anurag is the basis of how Krishna has become Naveen Madan. Therefore, after the Gopi Geet, when it says, Tasamavi Vacha Chori Ismaya Manam Kambo Jam, Pitambara Daswargri, Sakshat, Manmat. After all of the mood of separation, because separation nourishes, we were way off our subject matter. But it's a habit, I can't help, right? Because separation nourishes meeting. Because after the separation of Gopi Geet, when Krishna reappears, he then appears as Manmat. What's the meaning here? The nature of the separation and reappearance of Krishna made due to Anurag. In the extreme form of Anurag is Mahabhav. Because Anurag, then from Anurag becomes Mahabhav. Mahabhav has two divisions. Rud, Adirud. Adirud has two divisions. Modan and Mohan. Mohan is in everyone, right? Only Modan also in Radhika's group only. Right? This Modan is also only in Radhika's group. Mohan, Prayesh, it says Praya Vrindavaneshwarim in Ujalimani, is predominantly in Radhika. It spreads to her Sakis via Yavarasraivati. But primarily this deep mood of separation is in Radhika. And then that leads to Madan. You understand? Mother and Baba of Radhika. So like this, it's that praying which makes Krishna ever fresher, ever new. Now I got to get way back to wherever I was. Right in this. So
why ladies don't chant?
Because it's in the Kam Gayatri, and really Brahma Gayatri was given by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. It was not originally in our line. He gave one very famous lecture called Brahman and Vaishnav. And he wanted to prove that no matter what caste you come from, that if you're a Vaishnav, you're automatically a Brahmin. It's written in Sastra saying. Understand? So therefore he gave the Upavit, and he had the chanting of Gayatri Mantra for men in the thing. Now in Vedic culture, women did not chant Brahma Gayatri also. Understand? Now, if you look in our parampara and you go back, is Gopasharas Babaji wearing a Brahmin's thread. Bhaktivedanta Thakur, is he wearing a Brahmin's thread? They did not chant Brahma Gayatri. They chanted Gopal Mantra Kam Gayatri. Before that, or later after that time, also Guru Mantra was introduced in Guru Gayatri. Understand? But all these mantras are there in the Vaishnav Smritis, Vaishnav Tantra, but Guru Mantra, Guru Gayatri, Gaur Mantra, Gaur Gayatri is also there in Vaishnav Tantra, but they were added. But initially, Mahaprabhu only chanted the Daks Akshara Mantra, which is the last part of Gopal Mantra. Yeah? But the head of our parampara, Brahma, what did he chant? Huh?
Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
He chanted, after doing tapa here meant Saranagati, for 1,000 celestial years. From Divya Saraswati, he heard the Gopal Mantra. When he chanted the Gopal Mantra successfully, he realized from Gopal Mantra, Kam Gayatri. Even though we're talking about science, I have to come back to it because it's important. So actually, Gopal Mantra and Kam Gayatri are not two different mantras. From the Gopal Mantra, one realizes Sambandha. Through Mantramaya Upasan, he realizes Abhideya. The Mantramaya Upasan is Divya Vrindavana Kalpa Drumada, etc. This is the Mantramaya Upasan. The Sadhaka realizes their Mantramaya Upasan, this is my Ishtadev. That mantra describes the whole thing. Understand? Like Jiva Goswami saying in Ragmar, Krishna Smaram Janam Chasya, Nija Prestam Samanvita. So this mantra this verse describes that. Divya Vrindavana Nikalpa Drumara Srimad Ratnagar Singhasanasto, Shishira Rashila Govinda Devo, Preshta Alibi, Savior Mano, Smarami. Smarami means Ragmarg. And I'm realizing my Ishtadev in Mantramaya Upasa, means one view, one vision, etc. Seva Kunja is that same thing. You understand? One vision, one lila, not moving, and I'm meditating on that one lila in Gopal Mantra. When the mantra becomes successful, it manifests the moving leelas of Krishna called Swarasiki Upasana. So the leela starts to move. You understand? Shriman Rasarasarambi Vangsivata Tatakstita Kashan Venu Sunair Gopi Gopinata Suna. How they went to the bank of Vamsivat. Radhika had to do Abhisar. You understand? So then it starts to produce the realization of Swarasiki Upasana or the leela. And now, from Gopal Mantra, you should have your Krishnaya, your Sambandha. And you've been doing Abhideya with the focus of your Ishtadev. That manifests in your maturity as the Swarasiki Upasan, or doing worship in the mood of yourself in the Leela. Radhika is doing Abhisar. Wow, whoa. No, not quite. No, not quite. But now, in your Siddha form, when Bhava Vasas come, in that form, now you've entered into Swarasiki Upasan. Your Upasan, when you begin to chant Harinam, is in the Ashtakali Lila of Radha and Krishna. Understand? So when Radhika goes on Abhisar, then at that time, what is your seva related to Abhisar? Vasak Saja. Radhika will have to decorate a kunja, decorate. What are you doing at that time? You understand? Then the other elements, the other 6 elements of that, how you're participating and so forth and so on. Understand? So this is called Swarasiki Upasana. So my original point was the mantras that's what it leads to. And therefore, this is the meaning of Pra Cha Udayat. You understand? That made this fully manifest. This is my city. This is my full aspiration. Made that fully manifest in my heart. Understand? I don't know how we're going to back up now. Huh? Darwin, okay. All right, anyway, let's get to the point. All right, I'm going to go down. There are a number of things that atheists bring up, right, as arguments against the existence of God. One of the first things they do is they ask for, can you prove the existence of God? What's the problem with this?
There's a methodology for everything. And there's a process you have to undertake, like separating the milk from the yogurt. You need to go through a.
Even before that, there's a much deeper problem. It is called the assumptive posture. Who are you that you need to be proved something to? This is called the assumptive posture. If you say that God needs to be proved to me, it indicates you're in a position where you're somebody worth God having to prove himself to you.
It's like saying, prove to me that you exist.
Yeah, exactly.
That you exist, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
How do I know you exist?
Yeah, exactly. And that the thing is, what is my entitlement to having that proof? But the assumptive posture means, because whenever they introduce me as PhD scholar, Harvard University professor, peer-reviewed author. You ever notice that whenever they introduce these people, you got to go through the litany of this. So they stand on this is what's called the assumptive posture. I am somebody, so you have to prove to me now whatever it is that you want to say. And the science cartel has embedded that as part of the whole credentializing people, making them the authority. Who are you that you need to be proved to that there is a God? You understand? Well, now what to speak of, what's the methodology to find out how there's a God? Now, one of the things, no, well, that's the first thing. Let me stay in order here. Then the next question is, if there is a God, why is there one for Islam, one for Christianity, one for Krishna consciousness? Why are there so many gods? This is called a deflection. You understand? It's a deflection because the idea is, how many gods are there? How many cultures in the world are there? Innumerable, right? We can just say innumerable. So if there is a God, and God has two features, especially just principle speaking wise, omniscience and omnipotence, isn't it possible he could reveal himself differently in different places according to the nature of that culture, people, understanding, etc.? Is that something impossible? You could ask that same atheist, when you go to speak in an elementary school, you speak the same thing you do at your university class, right? So you obviously make your adjustments according to the audience that you have. So why would you ask, is there so many different gods? There's only one God. He's expressing himself differently. You understand? I gave the answer already. All right. Then the next thing is called theosophy, actually. But why, if there's a God, or there's so many imperfections, and especially why do bad things happen to, quote, good people? You understand? There's a whole study in the universe called theosophy that deals with this, right? Why, if there's a God, do so-called bad things happen to so-called good people? You understand? What's missing in that question? Personal responsibility. In other words, you've already assumed God has the responsibility for whatever's happening. You understand? You haven't given any sensibility to what's the personal responsibility of the individuals.
It also assumes good.
It also assumes good.
What is
Yeah, what is also the metric of what's good, what's bad is now also assumed by them. You understand? So now here's the thing also. So somebody goes and steals something, or somebody commits some other heinous crime. Is it God committing the crime or the person? So if the person committed the crime, right, you now have to take in, there must be some law, there must be some arrangement, just like we see in the material world, which I did for 17 years. If you commit a crime, right, and you get caught, what happens to you? You get punished. Now, here is the perfection of God. You are caught. This is called karma. So even if I didn't catch you, you get caught. And there's some wonderful stories about people avoiding getting caught. All right, I got to divert here for a second. I worked a case of embezzlement, and the person who was embezzling, it was like in the high numbers, like $150,000 or something like that. So I'm speaking to him, doing the interview and so forth, and you have to go to interview and interrogation school if you go to detectives and all that. So I'm interviewing him, every single thing they teach you in the school, he's actually doing, which is crazy. It didn't deviate the slightest. The body posture, none of it deviated. So then I finally just said to him, listen, they have a video, right? So when I said they have a video, his whole body posture changed, which is like, I'm caught, right? So then I asked him, but here's the thing, my friend. And we knew how much it was, but I said, listen, if it's under a certain denomination, it's only a misdemeanor. So I said, is it over that denomination? That was the question. Yeah. Understand? Right? And then what's really crazy, this is the craziest part. That money was in the trunk of his car because he panicked rather to keep it at home, try to bank it, or he had it. So then we went out to the car, opened it, his bags and bags of money back in the car. Understand? So the point being that karma isn't perfect police department, right? Whatever you do, that is definitely gonna come back. So that proves the perfection of God, actually. That those who don't take personal responsibility to follow the intrinsic moral code, which is also given by God, then ultimately you will have to account for that. That's also a perfection of God. God is only a subjective experience. It can't be verified. Now, here's the thing. God is certainly an objective experience, but we were talking earlier, can it be verified objectively? Yes. This is the point of intelligent design. What is this creation? When you make a discovery, you put nomenclatures on things. So let's go back to the discovery of the atom and how the atom works and all of that kind of stuff. Where did the names proton, neutron, electron come from? You just gave a name to something you observed. Was that power there prior to you coming up with the names? So then the question becomes, what was the power? You gave it a nomenclature, but what was the power? Do we have an answer for that? Andantra Paramanu Triantrastaham. It's written in Brahma-samhita, right? And he was now I'm gonna get to that in a minute. But he's saying there that God himself is in every atom. So everything you look at now that you see, which is only composed of atoms, this is our point that this is God. Because you gave a nomenclature, proton, neutron, electron. We said Krishna, Rama, Vishnu. What is the difference? Now the difference becomes you believe that. I believe this. So both things are truly subjective experiences, right? And both of them are objective experiences because for me, when I look at everything, I see God. You understand? So that's not a subjective experience for me. It's an objective one as well. Now, even if you say it's a subjective experience and you have 8-point-something billion people on the planet and 80% of them are having this subjective experience, it's an objective phenomenon. You understand? In other words, if suddenly tomorrow everybody in Alachua had the same epiphany at the same time, we wouldn't say that's just a subjective experience. That's some kind of objective phenomenon. And people would come and investigate it. So if you have 8.9 billion people, I think it is, on the planet, and 80% of them all have the idea of a superior being, and they see God as the genesis of everything, that's not subjective anymore. That's an objective phenomenon. Now, what you can do is you can investigate why all these people feel that way. But now, to your point, how will they ever get the subjective experience if you don't accept there is a reality beyond the empirical? What metric will you use to understand that there is a reality beyond this? You have to accept there is a metaphysical reality. Right? So even in the fields of psychology, like in the field of psychology, there was one psychologist, Chalmers, I think his name was, he described consciousness as the hard problem. If you haven't even breached what is consciousness, how can you understand what is the soul? How can you understand what is God, the super soul? If you can't even understand what is consciousness, still to this day, even though it's changing, again, science, God is in the science, so the science itself is becoming revelatory. And those who are more honest in heart, they're accepting the revelation that God is giving them in the science. So now, even in the science of psychology, they were doing experiments where they had people who had become completely so-called brain dead, but they were doing experiments where they could have other kinds of self-awareness. Because your brain deals with all your motor functions, speech, eyes, all these different things. And it also reacts to any sensual stimulation, all these things. But how do you have an awareness beyond that if everything is simply brain neurology? What is it that creates the emotion of love? What neurological function of the brain creates that? What creates the idea somebody believes in God? What is that? That's not brain neurology at work. So Jiva Goswami in Paramatma Sandarbha, he was describing 21 qualities of the soul. One of those qualities he describes first is called Swashmai Swayam Prakash. Swashmai Swayam Prakash means the nature of the soul is that through its consciousness, it can illumine things to itself, which means I can perceive all of you and I can understand my own self as well. Swashmai Swayam Prakash. So the power to understand both what's around you and understand yourself as separate from your surroundings is called Swashmai Swayam Prakash. So even Jiva Goswami wrote this, years ago. So if you don't understand consciousness, how can you possibly understand what is beyond the physical realm? You understand? Now another thing comes. God is you. Oh, they say that God is used in the absence of knowledge. In other words, they call it God of the gaps. That's a popular term they use, which means that anywhere you can't find the answer to something, you say, oh, God did it. We don't know what is the origin of life, which they admit, right? And also, here's another big thing that happens. Whenever you talk to them, they'll say, is there a God? I don't know, and nobody knows. Now, did you catch something in the phrasing? I don't know, nobody knows.
I don't know.
Here's the thing is, you just admitted God because you admitted there has to be a state of omniscience where you know nobody knows. You understand? You just said nobody knows. That's God. God has the omniscience to have every experience everywhere to know nobody knows. So really it reveals the egoism in yourself that you actually think you're God. This all comes from the assumptive posture. I don't know, so nobody knows. How would you know nobody knows scientifically? But here's the thing. You're a scientist who goes on the basis of posing a question, is there God? Then you're going to do a hypothesis. There's no God. Then you have to do the observation experiment. Did you observe everything, everywhere, everybody? If you did, you'd be omniscient. You understand? So you cannot make a statement, I don't know, and nobody knows. But what they do to deflect, remember part of their whole thing is deflection. What they'll do is say, yes, I don't believe there is a God. I don't believe there's unicorns and fairies. We weren't talking about unicorns and fairies, bro. You understand? But it's used as a deflection to minimize the state of ignorance that they're in. So you cannot speak absolutely or even intelligently about something you don't know. You have to essentially imbibe a posture of humility, which means you have to get off the platform of assumptive posture. You have to step down from that. Because if you say you don't know that there's a God, it means you're ignorant about whether there is one or not. So you have to avail yourself to any methodology, which, coming to Prabhu's point, that would reveal to you via an experiment that there is a God. In order to understand the transcendental position of God, there is a methodology. It is a metaphysical one, not a physical one. Because it's declared in scripture. Atahashi Krishna namani nabhavat grayam indriyai. By your material senses, you can't understand God. How did we understand that God is everywhere in creation? Was that an empirical thing we had? Or did it come by the revelation from the practice? It came by the revelation from the practice. Then we could see, oh, everything is God. That's why our Bhakti incentive this year is on the Chatur Shloki. But actually, always in our scriptures, we have these things. What is the first verse of Chatur Shloki? First verse. Aham. Memorize these verses if you don't memorize other verses. This is the first two lines. So it's saying here, before the creation, I existed. Was already existing. So we're saying based on our, like you're following your predecessors, because in science, they also follow predecessors. What papers they wrote, what's been peer reviewed. So we're also following our predecessors. So our predecessors have mentioned from this Bhagavatam, right, that Bhagavan himself is saying, God himself is saying, I existed before the creation. So we're accepting that. Do you know what existed before the creation? Don't know. All right, so now let's check our theory. So we're telling you, pick up a bee bag, come join us. You understand? Do the experiment to see if a metaphysical realization comes to you that shows you that this statement, aham eva sham eva gri, is true. You understand? If you don't do that, it's simply you're agnostic, which means you don't know if there's a God or not, with an attitude that makes you call an atheist. There's really no such thing as atheism. There's all agnosticism with an attitude. Because you don't know. So you cannot claim there isn't one if you don't know. That's not science. You understand? That's why I said it's called pseudoscience. It's not real science. Because it doesn't account for variables that you don't want to include. Simply because of your attitude, not because they don't exist. You understand? So this is the whole thing that I kind of wanted to communicate. We got off track in some places. And again, I'm not a scientist. It's also not my forte, these kind of things. But it's important because this kind of mood, theology, teaching in academia, and it permeates our culture and everything else, is the basis of materialism. Atheism is the basis of materialism. And materialism is the foundation under which the principles of Kali Yuga are advancing.
Also presented as being sincere as the foremost of
And it's all
sincerity.
not only sincerity, but it's presented as truth. So this is what's taught to kids in school. This is what's shaping the framework of the future. Now, there's an interesting purport that Bhumipati always quotes from the commentary of Sarartha Darshini of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur in the 11th canto of Bhagavatam, that the personality of Kali came to Krishna during the Mosal and asked, listen, what's my time? What's my time? What time am I supposed to check in? Right? When can I have my full manifestation? He says, as long as I'm present, it cannot happen. But remember, one of the things the sages at Namasharanya asked is, where is knowledge and religion, etc., after the disappearance of the Lord? This was the last question they asked. In the Bhagavatam, one of the 6 questions of the sages. What was the answer? Puranarko danodita. Krishna will still be present in this Puran, in Bhagavatam. So for as long as the teachings of Bhagavatam are present, Kali cannot fully manifest. So therefore it becomes extremely important to remove by relativizing or absolutely removing the concept of God for Kali to have full sway. So the Kali Chelas, they're using atheistic science as the basis of relativizing and removing the idea of God. And if you're not careful in academia, because our children go to school, right? They'll come out of education with the idea there is no God. Just think about it. Therefore, Prabhupada's pranam mantra now becomes really important. Nirvisesa sunyavari paschatya deshatarane. In the Western world, to remove the ideas of voidism and impersonalism, which are essentially atheistic. You understand? Impersonalism and voidism are essentially atheistic. Because is it atheistic or not? I am God. Is this what they're doing or not? Voidism, there is no God, there's nothing there. So Srila Prabhupada's essential part of his mission, more than Varnashram Dharma, was to imbibe the teachings. Gauravani Prachar. The Prachar, Gauravani Prachar, the teachings of Mahaprabhu, to remove impersonalism and voidism, because it's atheism. You understand? So it is important for us to have the tools and facility to defeat atheistic arguments. Understand? So I'm going to stop here if there's any couple of questions before we get going about anything. It doesn't have to be about this, but I wanted to get this presentation out. Right? And there's so many things I had to miss from these notes, but normally I don't speak from notes, speaking about Bhakti. Haribo Bhuji, and I'll come around. He's my science friend. I was going to lean on him.
So I'm trained as a scientist,
Uh-huh.
and I was a vehement atheist.
Uh-huh.
And it was totally an exhibition of arrogance and ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
I had just as much faith in my
For
atheism.
devotees
as I
on,
do now.
one second, for devotees on the Zoom, I'll repeat something if you don't hear it.
Okay. So I have just as much faith in my ignorance as I do now in Krishna. One thing that I've experienced is that Bhakti-yoga is a scientific method. And when I decided to enter into it, simply by following the instructions of my teachers, entering into the experiment, Krishna revealed himself in a way that I could not have. Simple as that.
Simple.
So everything, like I'm trying to understand the greater picture, the greater purport of why we have to work so hard at propagating this movement. If it is said in our Shastras that Kali Yuga lasts for 432,000 years, it's part of Krishna's design. Why is it that we have to engage so much with the atheists in arguing these points? I mean, I understand your points about our children wanting or needing to understand that the theory of evolution is just that, it's a theory, it cannot be proven. Please help me understand exactly why all this really matters when, you know.
All right, let me make a summary of it to the devotees on the Zoom. There's a Zoom going on at the same time. So Prabhuji is saying he's actually was a scientist. And he said during that time, he was an avowed atheist. And then upon coming to the path of bhakti and doing the process of bhakti, he had the epiphany and the realizations that that posture was not tenable. And therefore, he's now practicing bhakti. But he's asking the question now, because Kali Yuga is what it is, and especially it'd be going on for another, I don't know, we already passed through 5,000 years, and it's a 432,000 year period. Why is there such a necessity to engage with the atheist and atheistic science in terms of our duties, right? So part of the answer is the things I mentioned earlier, that it's the same way we see in Bhagavatam, the dealings between the devas and the danavas, means the demons and the divine personalities. The same way that we're going out to preach about Krishna consciousness in general, we're not only running up against people who are just in a mode of not understanding bhakti, but some don't understand bhakti based on the influences of atheism, right? Like in your own testimony, you understand? So our ability to have the facility to point out some facts about atheism in relation to the absolute truth becomes very important. I've experienced many times in my travel, because I run into a lot of people like new audiences, so to speak, and they're not really atheists. They're just people who are inquiring, how do we understand this? Is there any proof of God? That's not axiomatically an atheistic question. It's a genuine question. How can we prove there's a God? So we need to have facility to be able to answer that. And I don't have to go down the entire diatribe I just went through now about atheism and this and this and that, but to be able to explain that there is a difference between pseudoscience. And why are we calling it pseudoscience? Only because it's lacking the variables that science declares you need to have to do a proper observation, experiment, etc. If you take variables out of something, how can you in earnest do observation, experimentation, etc.? How can you do it? That's not even a scientific method that Bacon gave, right? Because Bacon actually was a theist, he just separated metaphysical investigation from physical investigation. But he didn't deny metaphysics. But here we have a denial of metaphysics. Now, here's the thing. Here's one point in describing these things. If you do come to a conclusion about something and you didn't account for the fact that there is a God by disproving it, you have to fully disprove it. You can't just say it doesn't exist, because is that scientific? That's a belief, right? You have to disprove it to make sure you're not missing a variable in your calculation. Is that true or not? So even if you say there is no God, you have to prove that fact to go forward, even in science. Or it's not really scientific, therefore it's called pseudoscience. Now, in our case, you mentioned that the process of bhakti is scientific. We have a history of experimentation. Now, here's one point I always make too. It's not going to be digestible to atheists. But do we have somebody who observed the beginning of the creation we can rely on? Who? Lord Brahma. And Brahma himself, in the first verse, he speaks, he says, Ishvara Parama Krishna, Satchidananda Vigraha, Anadi Adi Govinda, Sava Karana Karanam. He was there. Let me call my boy, he knows. You understand? He was there. He saw it. He saw what happened. Metaphysically and physically, he saw what happened. In fact, he was on the job. He was working there. You understand? So now you can say, well, you know, you have a hard time believing in people who have four heads and so forth and so on. But again, you haven't seen everything. Who are you? You're not God. You're not omnipotent or omniscient. Your posture to speak these things doesn't stand on a footing that makes it gospel because you said it. You understand? This is the problem. So this is called the assumptive posture. That is assuming you can speak and whatever you speak is gospel. That's not a fact, bro. That's how you be approached in the community. You understand?
The other fallacy in science is there's a
I'll
lot of
repeat it.
mythology in science. The myth of the Big Bang is actually unprovable. There is no experiment by which they can prove it. There is only assumption that it happened. The myth of one species turning into another has also not been proven because there was supposed to be something they would find called the missing link.
Right.
It was never found. You know, that's been 200 years ago.
Right.
Anyway, I want to come to a different question. You said, talked about the thing, why did that?
Let me repeat this to you. So Ramananda Prabhu is mentioning that science also is like a myth because the whole idea of the Big Bang and everything, nobody really observed that or anything. So it's like a myth that they postulate, right? And then secondly, what was the second one after that?
That one species would turn into another.
Then this whole idea of random mutation, natural selection, one species turns into another, it also hasn't been proven. So they keep saying, well, we'll prove it in the future. But now, even now, though, it's even worse trouble because they have the Cambrian explosion and the Qingman things in China. So Cambrian explosion means the way they used to do things is by what's called a fossil record. These fossil records are stored in the layers of sediment, right? So now they're finding, during this Cambrian period, they found so many species they couldn't account for, and there's no link to them. You understand? So now it puts a further dent in Darwin's theory about natural selection and this whole idea of random mutation and everything. You understand? And the second one?
The next point is about the statement about why do bad things happen to good people. I think that question came out of the idea that the Bible talks about how a lot of blade of grass moves without the will of the Lord. And I think we have that in the Vedic conception too, that everything is prakriti and that the Supreme Lord is in everything is happening by the arrangement of God. But it's not clearly understood. And so therefore people think, well, God is a puppeteer based on those statements, and that he's doing everything, in fact. So how would you resolve that?
So Prabhuji's next question was about the question of theosophy, which is why do bad things happen to even apparently good people? And this is one of the things they bring up regarding, like, if there was a God, he should be all good, which again is one of the imposed metrics, right? But he's asking, how would we resolve that if that's the case? So one of the resolutions is that what they're discovering now is that brain neurology doesn't also account for what is free will. In other words, the ability of any person to express themselves, that's not accounted for in brain neurology. What happens when they start contemplating it comes in brain neurology. Yeah, I'm thinking about robbing Fort Knox. I just can't take being broke anymore, right? So the brain neurons become stimulated by it, and your actions and all these kind of things. But that desire, I want to rob Fort Knox. By the way, if anybody's listening in the federal government, right, this is only a class. This is all hypothetical. So the idea here is that free will is an expression of consciousness. It's not something that can be found in brain neurology. So this proves that if there is a free will, there's also, as Vishaka mentioned earlier, responsibility related to free will. You understand? So this also doesn't say God's not in charge. It says that there is a minute free will in our subjective experience that allows us to do things whether it follows the intrinsic moral fabric or not, right? Like to rob people, to kill people, and so forth. Why do they even think this could be bad? Why does it come in the subconscious? That's not a function the brain is dictating. That's a moral question that arises subjectively. That's why people can do it, right? Why is it that some people can do those things with the idea, I know it's wrong, I don't care, right? Out of 17 years in police department, many people who did things like that, it wasn't a matter of them not knowing it's wrong. It was a matter, I don't care if it's wrong. You understand? And I'm talking about crimes that are not reward-seeking crimes. Reward-seeking crimes, I'm robbing somebody to get the money. There are crimes where people just beat somebody up or shot somebody or something else, or even you get the random like mass shootings and stuff, right? So now we go into mental health and all these kind of things, right? But the idea is that there is a moral idea that arises that they bypass. It indicates free will, which is a conscious phenomenon, right? It's not a neurological phenomenon, it's a conscious phenomenon. So God also has built in an accommodation for that kind of use of free will. What is it called? We mentioned it earlier. Karma. Therefore, now it spreads out into understanding why everybody comes into this creation in a different way. If it was simply based on random biology, right? And even if it's based on evolution, and people come, the genesis of people cannot be said to have started that somebody came this way, somebody came that way, and it's all due to evolution. Because here's my point. How does that account for your individual circumstances if you only live for 60 years? How does evolution influence that I was born in a poor family, rich family, with this handicap, that? How does evolution account for that? Because evolution is something that has to function over a long period of time. So how does it account for your 60-year iteration? I already came in under bad circumstances.
So then how does that resolve the idea of God, that everything, not a blade of grass moves without the will of God? See, that's that theistic idea that leads to this kind of challenge.
Yeah, but here was the point, that God's control of everything doesn't mean the absence of free will in part of his creation. That's what's the missing element, that there is free will within the creation. Because if there was no free will, the first imposition would be you have to accept me. You understand? That would be the first imposition on free will. You have to accept me. But what God does is God is controlling everything, but it's in parameters. Just like you have the right to commit a crime, but you also have the right to be locked up. You understand? So the free will is not imposed upon by the government. It's not imposed upon. But they have an overarching result for activities you do, good or bad. You understand? This is why even in the Chatya Shloki verse that I quoted, Nanyat Sat Asat Paramam. So this also means, one meaning here, Sat Asat Param means that cause and effect, Param, are still also controlled by the Lord, because the second line is declaring, during the creation, only I exist. You understand? So he's saying every cause and effect you see is also only me, inclusive of the independence of the jivas to act in their various ways. The power, because does the jiva have independent power?
Every cause and effect is God.
No.
Then all karma should go to God.
That somebody gave me this argument in Miami. But here's the thing. All the cause and effect means the power to carry out a cause and effect, not the desire to do a cause and effect. You understand? What is the first thing that comes up when you want to do something? Dhyayato vishayam pumsam sangas te shubhajaya. You understand that sequence that's given in Bhagavad Gita? Dhyayato, I am meditating. You understand? That I want to do this thing, good or bad. Now, who's the ultimate sanctioning authority? Unmanta upadrista, the super soul in the heart becomes the ultimate sanction. Well, then he still should get the blame. He knew this wasn't right. That I want to go down here and do this thing that was wrong. God knew it wasn't right. He shouldn't have let me do it.
Also, he exists beyond good and evil.
Not only exists beyond good and evil.
It's all things according to the desire, is the consequence.
So here's another big part of this whole argument, and that is on teleology. Teleology means purpose. If the world came by an unguided, uncontrolled process, there's also no teleology. There's no purpose, right? And you'll hear Richard Dawkins and others argue this point. There is no purpose. You just come here, you exist for some time. Of course, I got a silver spoon, I got a good job, everything else of mine is good. But when you die, you're gone. That's it. You understand? But what's the teleology? Why is this cycle there? Why is any of this there? What's the teleology involved? It means a purpose. The purpose is ultimately to understand the relation with God. The essence of the relation with God is one of love free will is an essential samagri in the ingredients of love. Because you can't be forced to love someone. 16th chapter Jiva Goswami, Bhaktivedanta Thakur states, this free will is an important ingredient. It's an intrinsic part of the samagri of love. So therefore he grants it. When you misuse it, right? But God puts up parameters, right? The parameters are you only get a certain amount of time to do this foolishness, for one, right? Secondly, if you do something and it's wrong, you are accountable for that. So this became Srila Prabhupada's famous statements on the misuse of free will. However, when that became overextended to the idea that that misuse of free will can take place in the spiritual world, you can fall, it lost its context. Understand? Let me check one thing. Is there any questions on the Zoom itself? I can't see all the people on there because I can only see the page that's in front of me. So anybody has a question, you can either raise the hand or you can just unmute and ask.
Yes, I have a question, Gurudev. Is Sanskrit, is it the oldest writing?
Yeah, I mean, as far as we know historically, even academia accepts that Sanskrit is the oldest language. It had different iterations before Sanskrit as we see it today. There was something called Pali. There were other kinds of iterations of Sanskrit language before what we know today. But yes, it's accepted as the oldest language.
And that was written by Vyasadeva.
No. Sanskrit existed previously. You also have to remember the idea of writing also was not the original communication mechanism. Previously, the ability of humans to hear something and digest it, they're called shrutidara. Shrutidara means you could hear something and hold it. So writing only became necessary during the advent of Kali Yuga. When the Kali Yuga came in, then because one of the things is that the memory in the Kali Yuga is very weak, then there was the beginning of writing. So the Sanskrit language then became a written language, and you see Devanagari, but even before that, as I mentioned, Pali and other earlier iterations of Sanskrit language were there. But now we use Painanese grammar and all these different things. You understand? So Sanskrit language as we see it today really has been an evolution. It wasn't originally what it is. All right, any other questions here? Then I'll come back to the Zoom. Yeah, you had a question then to go over.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's interesting what you were talking about earlier about the random, like they believe that everything's on chance, right? Random. But they also say their explanation is that if random occurrences happen trillions of times over, then these things can be produced. That's their explanation for the complexity of the world and the so-called. But to believe that and to have faith in that it still occurs like on each level, having that complexity, each eye, each microorganism, it's just too big of a faith.
Right. Well, what they're declaring now, which they have always declared, is that we don't know that for sure. But based on what Darwin said, from that premise, we think we can figure it out. But what's happened is with discoveries like the complexity in 1953 of the complexity of the cells and DNA and all these things, when you apply, because math is a big part of science, when they applied the math to the possibility that the genetic codes in the genome and all this could happen like this on a continuum, it was mathematically impossible. Understand? So then they said, well, if that's the case, then there's a big dip now in this whole theory because you can't prove randomness with the exactness that we see in the complexity of the building blocks of life, which is our cells and all these things. You can't find the mathematical possibility it could happen like that. So therefore, there's a serious doubt. So what they do is say, yeah, well, we'll figure it out later on, but we're not going to dismiss everything on the basis of that. Whereas the intelligent design people are saying, listen, we'll take the idea of evolution. Now, do we say there's evolution in spiritual metaphysics? What is the evolution in metaphysics? The evolution of the soul and consciousness. There is evolution. It's the evolution of the soul through various species of life according to the advancement of consciousness. Because the person is the metaphysical, and consciousness is the liaison between the two. You understand? So we say that consciousness in one iteration after another, as it advances, this is called metaphysical evolution. You understand? They're saying, no, evolution is strictly a empiric physical phenomenon, and it's not true. And it's even the theory is becoming weaker and weaker. But so first, the scientists are trying to introduce, let's just get started with the idea this cannot all have just happened with a big bang and some gumbo, right, and stuff, and then we had gumbo yesterday. That's what we did. All right, you understand? So, and it couldn't have happened. It just, there's no way. You have to put in some intelligent designer that has to be there. You don't have to use the nomenclature God, but you have to acknowledge intelligent design, because without it, you're just, it's like you're asking people to just, you know, accept something that, like you're mentioning, is ridiculous.
Then they say that it was designed by aliens and that we're in a simulation.
That's the new one. The new one is that, okay, it was designed by aliens, but then you're back to the origin where the aliens come from. And where did they get their information?
That's what I was gonna say, like.
Yeah.
Say the meteor, in the last 20 years, the meteor hit.
Yeah.
The first microorganism
Yeah.
which came from another world,
Yeah.
actually took up in that,
Without any proof yet, just a theory. But here's the thing. It just shows you how atheism becomes so much antagonism towards God. I'll think of anything to avoid having to acknowledge that it's God. So this is called envy. Because from the assumptive posture right now, I'm God. Who told me that? Harvard, Oxford. They told me I was God when I got out of here. They gave me that piece of paper. I was like God. Whatever I said was gospel. Yeah. I have tenure in being God. Gore?
I just wanted to mention something when when I saw your first flyer about divine science and material science or pseudoscience. So I used ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And I asked them, what is divine science? And you will be amazed at what they say.
Oh, they're not going to acknowledge it.
If you don't mind,
No, go ahead.
I will read it. Divine science generally refers to the systematic study of spiritual reality. God.
You're kidding.
Wow.
Oh, go ahead.
God, the soul, and the relationship between the individual soul and the supreme. Unlike natural science, which investigates the physical world through observation and experiment, divine science seeks knowledge through spiritual practice, revelation, reason, and realized experience.
But you know what? This is the thing about AI now. The thing about AI.
People question whether Krishna consciousness has made some influence
Yes.
around the world.
Where,
Here it is, right here.
where do you think they get that information? Because remember AI, all AI is doing is searching the broad spectrum of information. So who would have come up with those kind of definitions? From Bhakti. Yeah.
In the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition.
Hold on one second, wait, before you say. So devotees, let me repeat what he's saying. So he's saying if you go to ChatGPT and you put in what is divine science, it comes up with a Gaudiya explanation of what is divine science.
Yeah,
That's right.
Oh, his algorithm. Oh, you gotta check your algorithm? Oh my gosh. Yeah. Anyway, go to any AI and he says put it in and let's see what comes up. But on his, it came up an actual definition from Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which is interesting. Yeah, amazing. Finish. Go ahead. Okay, he's gonna finish. Go ahead, Gore.
All right. In the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, divine science is presented in texts such as the Bhagavad Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam. These works describe the eternal nature of the individual soul, Jiva, the existence of the Supreme Soul, Paramatma, the Supreme Person,
Krishna.
Right there.
That's your algorithm.
But here's the amazing thing that even that it exists in any way, form, or fashion by algorithm is an amazing influence of Srila Prabhupada and our tradition and our movement. This is very, very powerful.
Yeah.
And you could see that there is a pushback because if you went to standard old written dictionaries, they would not include this in any definition of science. Understand? Now, hopefully you don't run across an algorithm that says that it's actually whatever club you go to, this divine revelation coming from the club that night. That would be a problem.
If I ask you a question,
Yeah.
it says based on your spiritual
Outlook or something?
perception
Uh-huh.
or
for your belief,
Right.
this is what I have to say about it. It's my
Yeah.
algorithm.
Yeah,
But there's another way you can ask the more general question.
Right.
Giving evidence of the existence of God, and then you can make it very, very clear, based on actual facts, by
Right.
studying the universe, by studying
right,
the ecology,
yeah,
ecology of plants, by studying the DNA, etc.
And without
Based on
any religious.
without any religious text.
Yeah.
And you'll get beautiful, things that can.
yeah. Still, algorithm must play a part because I know I've put in there sometimes some things like that, and it will come back with pretty generic like things like, well, different religions have different perspectives according to modern science. This is not really in the purview of et cetera, et cetera. So, but the fact that anywhere, anyhow, under any circumstances, this exists is proof of the forward momentum of the thrust of especially Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Because Gaudiya Vaishnavism has answers for all these things. And there's a history of predecessors who could, because we had atomic theory in Vedic culture. There was advanced mathematics. I've been to Egypt, and when you go to Egypt and you look at the pyramids, right? Then in the pyramids, it's absolutely amazing, and they still have not figured out how they built them. With all the modern science, they haven't figured out.
Nor can they duplicate whatever.
They cannot duplicate it. Now, here's also interesting thing. When you go into the pyramids at Giza, you cannot, I think now, for tourists' sake, they've made an entrance. When I went, the only way to enter is through a particular thing. And when you go in, it forces you to bow down. You cannot walk in straight. You have to bow down. And once you get into the middle of the pyramid, you can raise up. And then when you're in the pyramid, along the inside of the walls of the pyramid is what is called, they call it hieroglyphics, but it's called meta-nectar in Egypt. And it winds and winds and winds, telling all stories about spiritual stuff. In the very top of the pyramid, the guy, he shines a light up there, and it's capped with a black stone. The geological name of the stone is ammonite. The geological name of Shalagram Shila is ammonite. Yeah. All right. So we're getting late here. What time? How much time we have?
12:30.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so when you talk to agnostics, one of the things that they say that they keep an open faith for God is that they feel that there's compellment towards truth, desire to go towards truth, and it's intrinsic within them. And so when we view Shraddha, I think it's mentioned in Jaya Dharma from the Chandogya Upanishad that the essence of contemplation is Shraddha faith. That the Jiva, it's geared towards trying to align itself with the understanding of there's a presence who is for me, he's taking care of me, and the job of the material world is to remove that. We talk about asat sangha, we talk about in terms of that sangha, which is everything contrary to the element of truth that takes us away from truth. And everyone, it seems like those who are in asat sangha, they're trying to get you to believe there's something besides God that will give you shelter. This material giving into your senses, or just following your country, that will give you relief, where you'll finally be able to be your true, honest, and truthful self. So what is it that why is it there's always a war for the jiva between doing asat sangha and trying to understand that there's a reality that's for me that exists?
So Prabhu was mentioning that even among many agnostics, they feel an internal draw, even though they don't know for sure whether there is a God or not. There is a kind of internal draw towards trying to understand where they can find shelter, if I'm making a synopsis of what he's saying. And why is it then that it becomes so difficult, the struggle between the jiva and the material world, that even, I guess, gives rise to the possibility of atheism having so much influence? So part of the answer will be the spiritual climate we live in, which is this time Kali Yuga. Each period has a particular spiritual climate. So from Satya Yuga to Treta Yuga to Dwapara Yuga, then to Kali. In Kali, the 12th canto of Bhagavatam mentions the spiritual climate of this time doesn't afford the optimal natural experience of the jiva. Natural experience of the jiva is that it's part and parcel of God. Again, Jiva Goswami in the Paramatma Sandarbha, among the 21 things he mentions, the last things he mentioned is Paramaika Seshita, that the Jiva is the Sesh Tattva of Paramatma. So the Jiva Shakti actually in this world comes from Paramatma. So, and he's Sesh Tattva means that he's naturally, intrinsically modeled to worship the Seshayi Tattva, which is Paramatma. Like a concept, just like Jiva Krishna Nitya Das, this Dasita or Seshita is a constitutional reality. Jiva Goswami says, Dasa Bhuti Hariva, Nanyasha Eva Kadachana. You cannot change that. So because it's a constitutional reality, there's a natural impulse within the Jiva that you have to cover with various layers of the modes of nature, etc., to avoid, because it's an intrinsic quality. Swarup Tattva is not intrinsic. There's a difference. Your spiritual rasa, siddha, deha, etc., that's not an intrinsic thing. That is a thing that comes via, from our perspective, some scars, and is awarded by Bhagavan, Swarup Shakti, at the stage of maturation. Bhav, at the stage when Swarup Shakti descends. You understand? But there is a constitutional sensibility. I'm the Das of Krishna. The Visesh Sambandha Gyan comes at the time of Diksha, according to, I was speaking about this yesterday, and that's Visesh Sambandha means, who am I in relation to Krishna? Am I a cowherd boy, gopi, manjari, whatever? What am I? At the time you receive Diksha, in the Diksha mantras, the seed of that is given. This is the meaning of Mahaprabhu's saying, or it said in Chaitanya Charitamrita, Brahmanya Brahmati Kona Bhagavan Jeev Guru Krishna Prasate Pai Bhakti Lata. That seed is what's given at the time of Diksha. If we are Saranagat at that time, Diksha Kale Bhaktagane Atma Samarpan, Se Kale Krishna Kare Kare Atma Sam. At that very time, what is your Swarup is realized. So what is it that makes us unable to realize the Swarup even when we hear the Diksha mantras? We are not Saranagat fully yet. You understand? We're not fully Saranagat. Right? There's still like that footing in the material energy and footing here. So it doesn't come across. According to the Adhikar, previous impressions, Praktanic samskars and Adunik samskars means the impressions now. According to that, the maturation in the consciousness of the sadhaka will produce the degree to which they can catch the Sambandha Gyan coming at the time of Diksha. You understand? So, but constitutionally, because we're the Das of Krishna, even under all the influence of material energy, there's a sensibility, there is a God. You understand? Even, therefore, the mode of upasana, worship, comes in so many forms, including worship of the Virat Roop, means the material energy. So when you see in cultures of antiquity, if they worship a tree, a river, etc., they saw that as an expression of divinity. They didn't say the tree was God. They said this tree is a manifestation in our purview of God. You understand? There's a difference. All the years I spent in Africa, I studied deeply because I had some inclination prior to going, related to my previous experiences and whatnot. What is the nature of the worship in nature? Like, because in African culture, one of the things is that everything is deified. Like the river, one Orisha's name Oshun. There's a river called Oshun there, and they make all of their offerings there. So I was saying, well, why is it that I think this is like worshiping the demigods. Why is this worship of these various things? Their perspective was because we're operating in the material paradigm. I had to hear this from a more advanced person in that system. Because their ideal is I'm in the material paradigm and I want things related to the material paradigm, I'm approaching a manifestation of the absolute truth, which is called Olodumare, in order to appeal my case to get these things. If I wanted nothing but spiritual life, where would my appeal go? Directly to Olodumare. Understand? So it's very similar to the whole Devata culture in India. So I wrote an article a long time ago when I was preaching in Africa in a magazine called The Comparisons Between the Two Cultures. Because people will worship the Ashwini Kumar so they can have children. People worship Indra for rain. People worship Dip. So in the same way in these cultures, they will worship Shango for power and so forth and so forth. They worship Oshun, especially for physical beauty and all these kind of things. Right? I'm just paraphrasing here, but like this. So, but back to your point of your question, the intrinsic idea on the Das of Krishna is what is that sort of substratum in my consciousness that says, yes, actually I should have some relation to something beyond me. that is suppressed by the overarching ignorance coming from the material energy and a degree to what you're associated with it. So even when you start to move away material energy, there's perception, yeah, the material world is God. I don't clearly know who's Krishna, where he lives, what's the address, his email address, etc. But I do know that at least everything I see is related to God. Beyond that, oh, I know that there is a God who's the creator of all these things. Beyond that, oh, that creator has persona. Beyond that, the persona is Lord Vishnu. Beyond that, Vishnu has a genesis, right? The genesis of Vishnu is the Shankarshan. Shankarshan has a genesis. Baladev Tattva. Baladev is first expansion. And like this, there's an elevation of experience to the point of realizing Krishna.
In the talk with the Vaikuntha-vasis in the Srimad Bhagavatam, there's a discussion between Smarnam and Japa, or Kirtan, which one is more powerful. But in that talk, they're also talking about how it's only solely through discrimination, between what is temporary and what is eternal, that the mind is liberated from these holds towards material nature. Can you speak on it?
One more time, I didn't catch the last part.
It's through the discrimination between what is eternal and what is temporary. When the mind is fully understands that there's only suffering, my only relation is towards the eternal. Right. There's only suffering and with that which is not eternal. Right. That yes. is a cause of the disillusion between our connection.
All right, so we'll close out with this question. So the idea is that Jiva Goswami is mentioned in Paramatma Sandarbha again. Eka Rupa Sarupa Bhat Chit Ananda Atmaka. In the actual Jiva, there is no dukkha. So he gives a commentary, dukkha pratyogita. The word pratyogita comes from Nyaya Darshan, and it means the opposite of something, or something that's the antithesis of something. So the soul is the antithesis of suffering. There is no suffering in the soul. It is Sat Chit Ananda. But here the word Ananda means dukkha pratyogita. There's no suffering. It doesn't mean the bliss coming from subsequent realizations of Bhagavan. It only means there's no misery here. So misery is also not, and this is one of the things, even though you see a verse like the material world is dukkaliyama sashvatam, temporary and full of misery. It's not the Shakti that's temporary and full of misery, because it's Bhagavan Shakti. What it's speaking about is the combination of the Jiva with that energy, with a potential, with a sensibility of enjoying it. That is dukkalyam ashashvatam, always full of misery. Can you say Maya Shakti is miserable and temporary? It's a Shakti of Bhagavan. So it cannot be miserable or temporary. You understand? But my relationship to it under false egoism, that I am the enjoyer, that is temporary and that is miserable when I try to combine with it. You understand? Just like you could take two chemicals and the chemicals in their separate containers are benign. But you put them together, what happens? Some chemicals, boom. I went to an old explosive class at the FBI. Yeah, and it wasn't very enthusiastic. It wasn't very encouraging, I should say. You understand? They were talking about something called, again, this is only in case. They were talking about something called data sheet, right? Because I worked in anti-terrorism. They're talking about the fear now, what they call data sheet. Data sheet, see this piece of paper right here? Hold that piece of paper up. See that? So data sheet is something that's that thin. And if you put that data sheet, right, in a backpack, and you put a small amount of any explosive, Syntax or C4, you can blow up whole trains. To prove it, they took us to the FBI Academy in Quantico, and they made the experiment. They blew up an articulated bus so we could see it, right? So it was the anti-terrorism team and the FBI forensics team. So they make the experiment, they blow the bus up. The forensics team has to go down and piece everything together. They're picking up pieces of the bus that's the size of the phone. Wow. So then you're thinking, how easy is it to put that in a backpack and get on a train? You understand? So grace of God, not knocking on wood, metal, steel, aluminum, or anything else. Grace of God. The entire time I was there, nothing like that happened. Then after that class, you'll have to go back and report to the department. This is what we learned. This is what's happened. What do you want to do? So then they said, well, maybe we can make stations where people have to stop when they're coming in the morning, and you could check backpacks. Lawyer said, can't do that, because you can't just randomly start checking people's backpacks. You can't do it, right? That's a violation of the, search and seizure. You can't just do that, right? So then they said, well, just like traffic stops, you can pick every fifth person. And then what you're doing, you're setting up a sequence, right? So that's equivalent to traffic stops for DUI and all these kind of things, right? So you can't do that. Do you think anybody's going to follow that? You understand? In other words, if somebody did have ill intentions, they come down, they see you stopping every fifth person, what do you think they're going to do? Huh?
They're gonna be the sixth person.
They're not going to be the sixth person. They're going to blow themselves up right there. That was the model back at the time, right? Yeah, I went to an Israeli, class on this, and let's end the class. We'll just yeah. All right, devotees on the Zoom. Haribo, thank you. Next Sunday we'll be back to our regular Zoom and so forth and so on. Jai Sachinandan Gaur Hari Ki Jai. Haribo. So far, I think we can end the Zoom here.
Well, the real